In the winter of 1897, a logging crew of 41 men walked into the forests east of the Cascade Range. By the spring thaw, the camp was empty. The saws were still hanging on their hooks. The stoves were still packed with cold ash. And not one of those 41 men was ever seen again. That part of the story you can almost find. It shows up in a few old newspaper columns buried between livestock prices and church notices. A short mention, a logging camp gone quiet. Tragic, but not unusual for a brutal winter in that era. But there is another part. The part about what the search party found when they finally reached that camp in April, what they photographed, what they measured, what they carried back down the mountain in a crate they nailed shut before they left. And that part does not appear in any surviving record, not in the county ledgers, not in the company's own archive, not in a single newspaper still printing a month later. Somewhere between the discovery and the end of that spring, it was removed. Not lost, removed. And the difference between those two words is the whole reason this story still gets whispered about more than a century later. So let me tell you what the story says. I want to be honest with you from the start. Almost none of this can be confirmed through official documentation, because that is exactly the point. The official documentation is what went missing. What we have instead are the accounts that leaked out sideways, a deathbed letter, a surveyor's private notebook that was never meant to be public, a handful of old-timers who repeated the same details for decades without ever having met each other. When separate sources with no connection keep describing the same impossible thing, you start to pay attention. This was the height of the timber boom. The great forests of the Pacific Northwest were being cut down faster than anyone could track, and companies were pushing crews deeper and deeper into country that had no roads, no telegraph, and no way out once the snow came. Men died in those mountains all the time. They died under falling trees, in swollen rivers, in fires, and in fevers. So when a camp went silent, the machinery of that industry was built to absorb it quietly and move on. A vanished crew was a line in a ledger and a letter to a family, if a family could even be found. That is what makes this particular camp different. It should have been absorbed and forgotten like all the others. Instead, someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure it was forgotten in a very specific way. The camp sat in a valley that, according to the company's own maps, had never been logged before. Fresh timber, untouched. That was the whole reason the crew was sent there. The location was so remote that the company had to cut a temporary trail just to get the men and their gear in before the first heavy snow. Once that snow fell, the valley was sealed off from the world as completely as if it had been on another continent. No runner could get through, no message could get out. For 4 or 5 months of the year, those 41 men were entirely on their own, and everyone involved understood that going in. They arrived in November. The last confirmed contact with the outside world was a supply runner who reached them in early December. He reported everything normal, men working, timber coming down, spirits high. He was the last person to see them alive and come back to describe it. When the next supply run was due in January, the weather closed the pass. Nobody thought much of it. Crews got snowed in all the time. They had food, shelter, and a foreman who knew the mountains. The company assumed they were fine. It was not until the pass reopened in April that a small party finally went up to check on them. What they found in that valley is where the record stops making sense. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker, and I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of what was found at the Cascade logging camp, the surveyor's original field notes, the county's order to seal the site, the names and dates of the men who erased it from every ledger, I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's continue. The search party was 6 men, a company representative, 2 experienced woodsmen, a doctor from the nearest town, and 2 labourers to handle the horses. They expected to find bodies. A camp that goes silent through a Cascade winter usually means fever, or starvation, or fire. They came prepared for a grim recovery. What they were not prepared for was a camp that looked like everyone had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. The bunkhouse doors were open. Beds were made. On the long table in the mess hall, tin plates were set out with food still on them, frozen, solid and untouched. The cook's ledger lay open to the correct date for a meal that was never eaten. The foreman's pipe rested on the arm of his chair, packed but unlit. Every sign pointed to a camp that had been fully, normally alive right up until a single moment. And then nothing. No bodies. No blood. No sign of a struggle. No tracks leading out into the snow, which, if 41 men had walked away, should have been impossible to miss. The snow around the camp was undisturbed except for the animal trails you would expect. Whatever happened to those men, it did not involve them leaving on foot. There was one more thing in that camp, and it is the only voice we have from the men themselves. In the foreman's quarters, the party found a work journal. The early entries were exactly what you would expect. Board feet cut, weather, a man with a broken hand, rations holding, ordinary. But somewhere around the middle of December, the tone of the entries changes. The foreman writes that the crew, while clearing a stand of old growth at the eastern edge of the valley, had struck stone. Not a boulder, a wall. Fitted, worked, deliberate. He writes that the men were unsettled by it, that some of them wanted to stop cutting near it, and that he had told them to keep working because the timber contract did not care about old rocks. The last legible entry is short. It says only that they had found the way in, and that he did not like what the cold air coming out of it carried. After that, the pages are blank. Whatever happened fast enough that no one wrote it down. The doctor read that last line aloud to the others, and according to his account, nobody answered. They all understood what it meant. The men had found something, opened it, and then ceased to exist in the space of a single afternoon. A camp of 41 working men does not fall silent by accident on the very same day it breaks into a sealed structure that had been waiting under the earth for who knows how long. The two events were connected. They simply did not yet know how. Now, if that were the whole story, you would already have a genuine unsolved mystery. Frozen plates, empty beds, 41 vanished men, and a journal that stops mid-thought. That alone would be worth talking about. But it is not why the record got erased. A camp full of disappeared loggers is a tragedy. It is not a secret. You do not send men up a mountain to seal a site over a tragedy. They erased it because of what was standing at the far edge of the valley. None of the party said much as they walked toward it. The doctor's account describes the strange quality of the light in that part of the valley, the way the trees seemed older and denser there, the way the horses did not want to go closer. What they were looking at did not belong in their century, and on some level they all understood that before a single one of them could put it into words. It is one thing to hear a story about the impossible. It is another to stand in the snow in front of it, close enough to touch, and feel the certainties you were raised on quietly come apart. Because the crew had not been the first thing in that forest. When the search party walked past the last of the bunkhouses toward the tree line, they found that the loggers had been clearing timber right up against a structure that, by every account, should not have been there. Because the valley had never been logged, never been settled, it was, on paper, empty wilderness that no human hand had touched. And yet there it was, stone, not timber, not the rough stacked rock of a frontier chimney, but cut and fitted stone, the kind of masonry that takes skilled hands and a great deal of time. Half of it was buried, as though the ground itself had risen up around it over a very long stretch of years. You have to picture what that means. Not a ruin sitting on the surface where a passing hunter might have stumbled on it. Something that had been swallowed by the earth so completely that a full-grown forest had taken root on top of it, and that forest had itself grown old. The trees the loggers were cutting were themselves the better part of a century old, maybe far more, which means whatever was under them had been buried and forgotten for far longer than that. Long enough for a mountainside to grow over it. Long enough for every trace of the people who built it to vanish from maps, from memory, and from history. The loggers, it seems, had been slowly uncovering it. Their axes and their saws had been chewing away at the trees that grew over it, and in doing so they had exposed a wall, a doorway, and a set of steps leading down into the earth. Before we move on to what the second search party found, stop for a second. What you just heard about the sealed bunkhouse is the part that changes everything, but it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the original inspection report. The bolted door, the measurements that don't match, it's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The doctor, the only member of the party with any formal education, is the source for most of the physical description. The steps, he wrote, were worn smooth in the centre, the way stone stairs wear down only after thousands upon thousands of feet have passed over them across generations. But this was a valley nobody had ever lived in. There were no generations. There was no one to wear those steps down. And yet the stone told a different story than the map did. That contradiction is the heart of everything. The official history said the land was untouched. The stone said the land had been walked, worked, and lived in by a great many people over a very long time. One of those two things was a lie, and the men who came up that mountain in April were suddenly standing in the middle of proof that the accepted version of the region's past was simply wrong. They did what frightened, practical men do. They tried to measure it. The woodsman paced out the exposed foundation. The doctor made sketches. And here is the detail that gets repeated in every version of this story, the one that seems to have unsettled them more than anything else. The stones did not match any standard they knew. The blocks were too large to have been moved by the tools of the era, without heavy equipment that could never have reached that valley. Some accounts claim the joints between the stones were so tight that a knife blade could not be slipped between them. Whoever built it had command of a technique that the men standing in front of it could not explain and could not reproduce. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of detail that grows in the retelling. Tight-fitting monumental stonework shows up in a lot of old stories, and it is worth staying skeptical. But it is also the specific claim that the later cleanup seems most concerned with burying. When you see which facts get scrubbed hardest, you learn something about what somebody was afraid of. The party did not go down the steps that first day. It was late, the light was failing, and something about the place had put every one of them on edge. They made camp in one of the bunkhouses, and by every account, none of them slept. The woodsman reported hearing sounds from the direction of the structure, not wind, not animals, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to come from underground. The doctor, ever the rational man, wrote that it was almost certainly water moving through hidden channels in the rock. He wrote that, but he also wrote that he kept a lamp burning until dawn, which is not the behaviour of a man who truly believed it was only water. At first light, 2 of them went down. What they found below is where the accounts split, and where I have to be the most careful with you, because past this point the sources thin out fast. The men who went down did not write much about it. The company representative confiscated the doctor's notebook, or so the story goes, though the doctor apparently kept a second one. What survives are fragments, a description of a long passage, chambers opening off of it, walls covered in markings that were not letters and were not pictures, but something in between, something that repeated in patterns, and a central room, larger than the rest, that the 2 men refused to fully describe even years later. One of the woodsmen, decades on, would only say that the room had not been empty. He would not elaborate. When pressed, he changed the subject. When pressed harder, he left the room. That is the entire testimony about the central chamber that we have. A refusal, and sometimes a refusal tells you more than a description would. The 2 men came up the steps pale and shaking, and the party made a decision that afternoon that they would leave and report only that the camp was lost with all hands. They agreed among themselves. Whatever was down there was not something for 6 men to handle, and it was not, they seemed to feel, something the world was ready to be told. They photographed what they could. They filled a crate with whatever small objects they had carried up from below, and they nailed it shut and hauled it back down the mountain. That crate is the last physical evidence anyone claims to have seen. It went to the company office, and then it went somewhere else, and the record of where it went was, like everything else, removed. Here is where the story stops being about a logging camp and starts being about the erasure itself. Because within weeks, the accounts agree, men arrived from somewhere higher up than the local company office. Nobody could say exactly who they answered to. They were organised, they were funded, and they moved with the confidence of people who had done this before. They went up to the valley, and when the pass was fully clear that summer, the structure at the edge of the camp was gone, not covered, not sealed. Gone, dynamited, filled, and buried under fresh soil and replanted timber until the valley looked like it had never held anything but trees. The camp buildings were burned. The company maps were quietly redrawn. The newspaper that had run the first short mention of the vanished crew printed a correction the following month, claiming the earlier report had confused two different camps and that no such disappearance had occurred. That correction is the one piece of paper in this whole story that actually survives, which tells you something. The lie survived. The truth was the thing that had to burn. The 6 men of the search party were paid, generously, by the standards of the time, and each of them, in his own way, spent the rest of his life either saying nothing at all or saying too much to people who did not believe him. The doctor left the region entirely. The company representative was promoted and never spoke of it. The 2 woodsmen stayed in the mountains and became the source, through decades of firelit half-confessions, for most of what we think we know. So what was it? What did 41 men uncover that was worth this much effort to unmake? The honest answer is that we do not know, and by design, we may never know. But the shape of the cover-up points at something specific. You do not spend that kind of money and coordination to hide a tragedy. You hide a tragedy by mourning it loudly. What you bury in silence is a fact that breaks the story you have told about the world. And the fact buried in that valley was simple and enormous. Somebody had been there first. Somebody with skill, with numbers, with time, and with a way of shaping stone that a 19th century logging crew could not match. Somebody whose existence did not fit into the tidy history of an empty frontier waiting to be claimed. That is the thread that connects this story to dozens of others like it. Structures found where no structure should be, foundations too old and too advanced for the history books. Discoveries that are made, documented, then quietly unmade. Taken alone, each one is easy to dismiss, but laid side by side, they start to rhyme. Something found, something erased, and a record that afterward insists nothing was ever there at all. Maybe the loggers are the key. 41 men who did the one thing nobody was supposed to do. They uncovered it, and in doing so they forced a choice on people who would have preferred it stayed forgotten. The men themselves became part of the thing that had to disappear. Whether the valley took them or the cleanup did, the result is the same. They are not in any record either. 41 men who, on paper, might as well have never been born. I cannot prove to you that any of this happened the way the story says, and I want to be completely straight about that. This is a reconstruction stitched together from leaks and refusals and the strange, stubborn consistency of accounts that had no business agreeing with each other. It could be legend. It could be a frontier ghost story that grew 100 new details every time it was told around a fire. But then you come back to that newspaper correction. That real, findable piece of paper, insisting a little too firmly that nothing happened in a story that is otherwise all silence. You do not deny a thing that no one has claimed. And the moment you notice that, the whole careful silence starts to feel less like an absence and more like a shape. The shape of something large, pressed down hard, and covered over just well enough that we are still standing on top of it without knowing. That valley is still out there. The timber grew back long ago, and whatever those 2 men saw in the central chamber, the thing one of them would leave a room rather than describe, is either gone forever or waiting exactly where it has always waited, patient as stone, for the next people who wander in and start to dig. If this story got under your skin the way it gets under mine, subscribe and stay with me. Because the deeper you follow this thread, the clearer the pattern becomes, and the harder it gets to believe the version of history we were handed. There is always another valley. There is always another record that ends mid-sentence. And there is always someone, somewhere, still holding the shovel.